December 12, 1991, Copacabana Beach, Rio de Janeiro. A 10-year-old boy runs through crowds of tourists. His name is Altair Medeiros de Abreu. He's terrified, traumatized, and he's alone. His 6-year-old brother Ivan is dead. The man who killed him? He's standing 30 feet away, calmly handing out flyers to beachgoers, smiling, acting normal, like nothing happened. When Altair finally escapes and tells police what he witnessed, they make an arrest 7 days later. And what the killer tells them will shock the entire nation. This wasn't his first victim, not even close. For 9 months, someone had been hunting children in the slums of Rio de Janeiro. Poor boys between the ages of 5 and 13. Kids who could be lured away from safety with the promise of just a few dollars. The victims disappeared from streets, parks, beaches. Their bodies were found days or weeks later in shallow graves. They had been strangled, sexually assaulted. Some showed signs of even more disturbing violations, but the police hadn't connected the cases. In a country where hundreds of children were being murdered every year by vigilante death squads, these disappearances were just more statistics. Nobody realized they were hunting for one man, a man who would later be called the Vampire of Niteroi. His name was Marcelo Costa de Andrade. He was 24 years old. He looked ordinary. He worked a regular job. He lived with his family. And when police finally interrogated him, his confession would reveal crimes so grotesque that investigators struggled to believe what they were hearing. He drank the blood of children. He decapitated at least one victim. He took their clothing as trophies. He violated their corpses. But the most disturbing part wasn't what he did. It was why he did it. His explanation would be so insane, so completely detached from reality, that psychiatrists would spend years trying to understand his mind. This is the story of one of Brazil's most notorious serial killers, a man who committed unspeakable acts while believing he was performing a divine mission. This is the Vampire of Niteroi. To understand Marcelo Costa de Andrade, you first need to understand the Brazil he grew up in, a country waging an undeclared war on its poorest children. In 1991, the same year Marcelo committed his murders, 427 children and adolescents were murdered in Rio de Janeiro state alone. In the first 6 months of that year, another 411 children were killed across São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, and Recife. That's more than 2 children murdered every single day. But these weren't random crimes. According to a Brazilian parliamentary commission investigating the violence, most killings were carried out by death squads, criminal gangs, often including off-duty police officers, hired by local business owners to clean up the streets. They hunted homeless children like animals. Between 1988 and 1990, federal police documented 4,611 children between the ages of 5 and 17 as victims of violence. In São Paulo state alone, 2,050 children were killed in just 3 years. In the Baixada Fluminense, the poorest suburbs of Rio de Janeiro, 306 children were executed in 1988. The commission recorded 92 child murders between March and September 1991 alone. The targets were street kids, orphans, runaways, boys and girls living in favelas who begged for money, sold candy, or shined shoes to survive. Society saw them as disposable problems, criminals in training, vermin to be eliminated. Amnesty International documented cases where death squads would drive through poor neighborhoods at night, shooting children as they slept on sidewalks. Some victims showed signs of torture before death. Many were never identified. This was the Brazil where Marcelo Costa de Andrade hunted his victims, a country where poor children's lives were worth nothing, where a boy could disappear from the streets and nobody would even file a police report. And this was also the Brazil where Marcelo himself grew up. Marcelo Costa de Andrade was born on January the 2nd, 1967, to poor immigrants from Brazil's impoverished northeastern region. His family settled in Rocinha, one of Rio de Janeiro's largest favelas, perched on steep hillsides overlooking the city's wealthy neighborhoods. By the 1960s and 70s, Rocinha had transformed from a rural settlement into a massive urban slum. Residents built their homes vertically along narrow corridors and steep staircases, creating a densely packed warren of makeshift housing. There was no running water in most homes, no electricity, no sanitation, and into that power vacuum came the drug cartels. Armed traffickers became known as owners of the favela. Residents faced constant danger from gang violence, police raids, and turf wars. Shootouts could erupt without warning. Bodies appeared in the streets overnight. This was Marcelo's childhood home. His mother worked as a maid in the wealthy neighborhoods below, laboring for pennies, while her own children went hungry. His father was violent, beating both Marcelo and his mother regularly. When Marcelo was 5 years old, his parents divorced. To protect him from his father's abuse, his mother sent him hundreds of miles away to live with his grandparents in Ceará State. The violence followed him. His grandparents beat him with belts and other objects. The beatings were severe, frequent, inescapable. Eventually, they sent him back to Rio de Janeiro. But what awaited him there was worse than anything he'd experienced before. His mother had a new partner, and that man began sexually abusing Marcelo when he was just 10 years old. Other relatives raped him too. The abuse was systematic, ongoing, devastating. Authorities briefly placed Marcelo in a boarding school for boys, but he struggled academically. His classmates bullied him mercilessly, calling him retarded and mocking his learning difficulties. The school policy only allowed boys up to age 14. When Marcelo reached that age, he was expelled. At 14 years old, with nowhere to go and no one to protect him, Marcelo turned to the streets. He became a prostitute. Marcelo spent his teenage years selling his body on the streets of Rio de Janeiro. According to his later statements to police, he usually took the active role with clients. But one day, a client forced him into the passive position. The experience shattered something inside him. Marcelo attempted suicide. Instead of receiving mental health treatment, authorities placed him in FEBAM, a juvenile correctional facility notorious for violence and abuse. Marcelo escaped after several months and returned to the streets. But something fundamental had changed. The line between victim and predator was beginning to blur. At 16, Marcelo began a relationship with an elderly man named Antonio Batista Freire. Antonio introduced him to the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God, a neo-Pentecostal movement that had exploded across Brazil since its founding in 1977. The church was known for dramatic, emotionally intense services where members cried out to God during fervent prayers. Pastors promised prosperity and healing to followers who demonstrated sufficient faith. But the church was most famous for its exorcisms. Universal Church pastors performed regular exorcisms on members believed to be possessed by demons. They taught that evil spirits caused illness, poverty, addiction, and suffering. During exorcisms, possessed individuals would shake violently and speak in altered voices. Pastors would demand the demons identify themselves, then cast them out through prayer. Marcelo attended services regularly. He absorbed the teachings completely, and at 17, while still with Antonio, Marcelo attempted to rape his own 10-year-old younger brother. Police would later discover he had audio recordings of the boy crying, recordings that sexually aroused him. After his relationship with Antonio ended, Marcelo returned to his family. He stopped working as a prostitute and got a regular job to financially support them. To everyone around him, he seemed like an ordinary young man trying to make an honest living. But inside his mind, something monstrous was forming. Somewhere during his time attending the Universal Church, Marcelo heard a teaching that would reshape his entire reality. Children who die go directly to heaven. For most people, this is a comforting spiritual belief meant to ease the pain of losing a child. But for Marcelo, whose mind had been shattered by years of abuse, rape, and trauma, this teaching became something else entirely. It became a divine mission. Marcelo looked at the children of Rocinha's favelas and saw his own childhood. He saw hunger, beatings, sexual abuse. He saw kids begging on streets, selling candy for pennies, going days without food. He saw children sleeping on sidewalks where death squads hunted them for sport. And in his delusional mind, death became their salvation. By killing these children, Marcelo convinced himself he was rescuing them from lives of suffering. He was liberating them from poverty and pain. He was sending their innocent souls straight to paradise, where they would never be hungry, never be beaten, never be raped again. He wasn't a murderer. He was a savior performing God's work. This grotesque religious delusion gave Marcelo permission to act on his darkest urges, his pedophilic attraction to young boys, his necrophilic compulsions, his violent sexual fantasies. He could rape children, murder them, violate their corpses, and convince himself he was following divine will. The delusion was complete. And in April 1991, when Marcelo was 24 years old, he committed his first murder. April 1991, the first kill. Marcelo was walking through the streets when he saw a young boy selling candy. The child was alone, vulnerable, poor. Marcelo approached with a story about a Catholic religious ritual that required the boy's help. He promised money, enough to seem like a fortune to a child who had nothing. The boy believed him. Marcelo led him to an isolated location. There, he raped and murdered the child. And when it was over, something inside Marcelo snapped completely. He had crossed a line he could never uncross. June 1991, Oder José Muniz dos Santos. In June, Marcelo spotted 11-year-old Oder José Muniz dos Santos begging on the street. He told Oder that his fictional aunt would give the boy 3,000 cruceros if he came along. Oder, desperate and hungry, followed him to an abandoned football field. Marcelo attempted to rape the boy. When he couldn't complete the act, rage consumed him. He strangled Oder to death with his bare hands. But even after Oder was dead, Marcelo strangled him again to make sure his soul reached heaven. Then he went home for lunch. He sat with his mother and told her he needed a machete to cut bananas. She gave it to him without suspicion. That night, Marcelo returned to the football field and decapitated Oder's corpse. Police would later find that machete in his home. Anderson Gomez Goulart, the blood ritual. The pattern was set. Marcelo's methods became more calculated, more grotesque. With 11-year-old Anderson Gomez Goulart, Marcelo struck him in the head with a rock to subdue him, then strangled him to death. After Anderson was dead, Marcelo collected the boy's blood in a bowl, and then he drank it. He believed that by consuming the blood of beautiful children, Their physical beauty would transfer to him. The blood would make him handsome, desirable, transformed. After drinking Anderson's blood, Marcelo raped the corpse. Then he broke the boy's neck, even though Anderson was already dead. The violence was excessive, compulsive, a complete loss of control, masked as ritual. The hunting pattern. By now, Marcelo had perfected his methodology. He exclusively targeted boys between ages 5 and 13 from the poorest favelas. These were children often on the streets unsupervised, selling candy, begging for money, shining shoes. Kids whose disappearances wouldn't trigger intensive police investigations. He promised them money, 3,000 to 4,000 cruzeros, just a few US dollars. He told elaborate stories about Catholic rituals or fictional relatives who wanted to help them. The religious framing made his lies seem trustworthy. Marcelo used public transportation to move victims away from their neighborhoods to carefully selected locations: deserted beaches, abandoned football fields, overgrown areas where screams wouldn't carry. If a boy resisted, Marcelo used rocks to knock them unconscious. Then he strangled them with his hands, with their own clothing, whatever was available. After death, he raped their corpses. He took their shorts as trophies. With at least one victim, he pulled out the boy's teeth, though police never determined why. He buried the bodies in shallow graves and walked away, convinced he had performed an act of mercy. The Brazilian media would later call him the vampire of Niteroi because of his blood-drinking rituals. But Marcelo saw himself differently. He was an angel of death, delivering suffering children to paradise. Between April and December 1991, Marcelo Costa de Andrade murdered 14 boys in the areas around Itaboraí and Niteroi, approximately 30 kilometers from Rio de Janeiro's city center. 14 children in 9 months, more than one victim per month. Most of the victims' names were never publicly released. Their families' grief remained private, shielded from the media circus. But each disappearance followed the same pattern: a poor boy from the favelas, alone on the street, approached by a friendly man with promises of money, then gone forever. Some families reported their sons missing, but in a country where hundreds of children were being murdered every year by death squads, individual missing persons reports rarely triggered investigations. Police didn't connect the cases. They didn't recognize the pattern. Each missing boy was just another statistic in Brazil's epidemic of child violence. Marcelo operated in plain sight. He worked a regular job. He lived with his family. He attended church services. To everyone who knew him, he appeared completely normal. But several times per month, he would leave home, find a vulnerable child, and commit unspeakable acts. And nobody stopped him. December 11th, 1991. On December 11th, Marcelo approached 2 brothers near their home, 10-year-old Altair Medeiros de Abreu and 6-year-old Ivan de Abreu. He made his usual offer, 4,000 cruzeros, to help with a Catholic ritual. The hungry brothers agreed and boarded a bus with him to a deserted beach near the Barreto Viaduct. Once isolated, Marcelo tried to kiss Altair. The 10-year-old became frightened and tried to run. Marcelo grabbed him and struck him to the ground. Dazed and bleeding, Altair could only watch as Marcelo raped his 6-year-old brother Ivan, then strangled him with his own T-shirt. Marcelo told Altair that Ivan was just sleeping. But unlike all of Marcelo's previous victims, Altair survived. Frozen with terror, Altair continued to obey Marcelo's commands through the rest of that day and into the next. The trauma was so profound that he couldn't process what had happened. He couldn't run. He couldn't scream. He could only follow. On December 12th, Marcelo took Altair to Copacabana Beach and began handing out flyers to tourists. Finally, in the crowds and daylight, Altair found the courage to escape. He ran. Even after reaching safety, the traumatized boy didn't immediately tell anyone what happened. Only the next day did he tell his sisters that Marcelo had killed Ivan. The discovery. Meanwhile, Marcelo made no attempt to hide Ivan's body. He returned to the crime scene and repositioned the corpse, though police never determined why. When authorities discovered Ivan's body, they initially theorized drowning, but the boy's hands were inside his shorts, inconsistent with drowning. An autopsy revealed sexual assault and strangulation. When Ivan's mother identified her son's body, Altair led police directly to Marcelo. December 18, 1991, arrest. 7 days after the murder, police officers arrived at Marcelo's workplace. They found him sitting in a chair, eating his packed lunch. He showed no surprise, no resistance, no attempt to flee. According to police reports, Marcelo simply said he had been waiting for them to come. He confessed immediately. At the police station, Marcelo Costa de Andrade didn't just confess to killing Ivan de Abreu. He confessed to murdering 13 other boys over the previous 9 months. He described each killing in meticulous, disturbing detail. The promises he made, the isolated locations, the methods of subduing resistant victims, the way he strangled them to ensure their souls reached heaven. He explained his blood-drinking rituals, the trophy-taking, the necrophilia. He showed investigators where he had buried the bodies, and through it all, he showed no remorse, no guilt, no understanding that he had committed terrible crimes. Instead, he seemed genuinely confused about why he was being arrested. Seeking recognition. In one of the most chilling moments of the interrogation, Marcelo asked police whether there was anywhere in the world a case with more victims than his. He wanted to know if he was Brazil's star killer. At the time, media outlets were comparing him to Jeffrey Dahmer, the American serial killer whose crimes had shocked the world earlier that same year. Dahmer had murdered 17 young men engaging in necrophilia and cannibalism. The comparison was disturbingly apt. Both men targeted vulnerable victims. Both engaged in necrophilia and took trophies. Both were driven by profound mental illness, masked as ritual. Leading police to the bodies, over the following days, Marcelo calmly led police to the burial sites of his victims. He pointed out shallow graves where he had hidden their bodies. Some remains were too decomposed to identify. Others had been scattered by animals. But investigators confirmed at least 14 victims. The magnitude of the crimes dominated Brazilian news. The vampire of Niteroi became headline after headline. But Marcelo still didn't understand what he had done wrong. Marcelo underwent extensive psychiatric evaluation following his arrest. Multiple specialists examined him through psychological tests, interviews, and behavioral assessments. The findings were unanimous and disturbing. The diagnoses psychiatrists diagnosed Marcelo with schizophrenia, severe distortions in thinking, perception, and behavior, antisocial personality disorder, complete disregard for others' rights, psychopathy, impaired empathy, and bold, disinhibited traits, low IQ, cognitive impairment affecting reasoning and judgment, necrophilia, sexual attraction to corpses, multiple other severe mental illnesses. The psychiatric experts concluded that Marcelo's religious delusions were genuine and complete. He truly believed killing children sent them to heaven. He genuinely could not comprehend that murder was wrong. His capacity to understand reality was so severely impaired that he met the legal definition of insanity. The impossible question, the evaluations raised a question with no good answer. What do you do with someone who is both genuinely insane and catastrophically dangerous? Marcelo's childhood had been filled with horrific abuse. Beaten by his father and grandparents, raped by his mother's partner and other relatives beginning at age 10, bullied at school, forced into prostitution as a teenager, traumatized repeatedly. Every system that should have protected him had failed. The abuse clearly contributed to his mental illness, but 14 boys were still dead. 14 families still grieved. Understanding the origins of his monstrosity didn't diminish the horror of what he had done. Brazilian law, like many legal systems, recognizes that some individuals are too mentally ill to be held criminally responsible in the traditional sense. April 26, 1993, the verdict. On April 26, 1993, more than a year after his arrest, Marcelo Costa de Andrade was declared legally insane and found not guilty by reason of insanity. He was committed to indefinite preventive detention at the Heitor Carrillo Psychiatric Clinic. He would undergo annual psychiatric evaluations. Only if he was deemed cured and no longer dangerous could he potentially be released. Year after year, the evaluations reached the same conclusion. Marcelo remained profoundly mentally ill, delusional, and dangerous. He would remain institutionalized indefinitely. For several years, Marcelo remained confined at Heitor Carrillo. He underwent treatment. He was evaluated regularly. He was kept separate from other patients due to the extreme nature of his crimes. But in January 1997, something shocking happened. Marcelo escaped. The details of how he managed to escape from a supposedly secure psychiatric facility were never fully disclosed. Security failures, understaffing, inadequate protocols. Whatever the cause, one of Brazil's most notorious serial killers was suddenly free. For 12 days, Marcelo traveled more than 3,000 kilometers across Brazil. Where he went, what he did, whether he attempted any crimes. The authorities have never released complete information about those 12 days. No murders matching his pattern were reported during that period, but the possibility haunted investigators. After 12 days on the run, authorities finally recaptured Marcelo and returned him to custody. Transfer to Henrique Roxo. Following his recapture, Marcelo was transferred to Henrique Roxo Psychiatric Hospital, a facility with stricter security measures. The escape triggered investigations into conditions at Heitor Carrillo. What investigators found was disturbing: overcrowding, crumbling infrastructure, understaffing, and inadequate security. In 2015, the Rio de Janeiro Public Defender's Office successfully banned all new admissions to Heitor Carrillo due to human rights violations. Some patients had been held there for decades beyond their sentences, confined in conditions international observers described as inhumane. In March 2023, the ban became permanent. Heitor Carrillo would accept no more patients. 14 boys, 14 families destroyed, 14 futures erased. Most of the victims' names were never publicly released. Their families' grief remained private, away from the media spotlight that surrounded Marcelo's arrest and trial. But we know some of their stories. Oder José Muniz dos Santos, 11 years old, begging on the street when Marcelo approached with promises from a fictional aunt. Found on an abandoned football field, decapitated. Anderson Gomez Goulart, 11 years old, his blood collected in a bowl and consumed. his corpse violated and mutilated. Yvon de Abreu, just 6 years old, hungry and trusting when he followed Marcelo to a deserted beach, strangled while his brother watched, helpless. The other 11 victims remain largely anonymous in public records, but each one had a name, a family, a life that should have been lived. They were poor. They lived in favelas. They were the kind of children Brazilian society had learned to ignore, kids whose deaths usually didn't even make the news because hundreds of other children were being murdered at the same time. But their deaths mattered. Their lives mattered. And 10-year-old Altair Medeiros de Abreu, the only victim who survived, carried the trauma of watching his little brother murdered for the rest of his life. These weren't just statistics. They were children. Today, Marcelo Costa de Andrade remains confined at Henrique Roxo Psychiatric Hospital. He is now 59 years old. He continues to undergo regular psychiatric evaluations, and according to all reports, his mental state has not improved. Marcelo still doesn't understand that what he did was wrong. He still believes that by killing 14 boys, he saved them from lives of poverty and suffering. He still believes he sent their souls to heaven. The religious delusion that drove his crimes remains intact after more than 3 decades of confinement and treatment. He shows no remorse, not because he's callous, but because he genuinely cannot comprehend that killing children is wrong. His break from reality is complete and apparently permanent. Brazilian law requires that individuals found not guilty by reason of insanity remain in psychiatric custody until they are deemed no longer dangerous. For Marcelo Costa de Andrade, that day will almost certainly never come. He will likely spend the rest of his life in psychiatric confinement, still convinced he was following God's will. The case of Marcelo Costa de Andrade forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about violence, poverty, mental illness, and the value society places on its most vulnerable children. The social context: Marcelo's victims were drawn from the same population that death squads were systematically executing throughout the early 1990s. Poor children from favelas who were seen as problems to be eliminated rather than citizens to be protected. In 1991, more than 400 children were murdered in Rio de Janeiro state. Across Brazil, the number exceeded 1,000. These weren't accidents. They were executions, hunts. Marcelo wasn't part of the organized death squads, but he exploited the same social conditions they created. A society that didn't value poor children's lives, that didn't investigate their disappearances, that allowed them to vanish without consequence. He knew he could take a child off the street and nobody would look too hard. He was right. The cycle Marcelo himself was a product of that same violence. As a child, he experienced poverty, beatings, and sexual assault. Every system that should have protected him failed. Instead of receiving help for his trauma, he was beaten, raped, expelled from school, and forced into prostitution. His mental illness went untreated. His cries for help went unheard. The cycle was complete. An abused, traumatized child grew into a monster who destroyed other children's lives. This doesn't excuse his crimes. 14 boys are still dead. The horror of what Marcelo did cannot be diminished by understanding its origins. But it raises an urgent question. How many other Marcelos are being created right now by systems that fail vulnerable children? The psychiatric paradox. Marcelo's case also highlights the complex relationship between mental illness and criminal behavior. He was clearly profoundly mentally ill. His delusions were genuine. He truly couldn't understand that murder was wrong. But he was also a calculating predator who carefully planned his crimes, selected vulnerable victims, and took steps to avoid detection. Can someone be both genuinely insane and methodically predatory? The disturbing answer is yes. Marcelo's indefinite psychiatric confinement represents society's attempt to balance these realities, acknowledging he's too mentally ill for criminal punishment while recognizing he's too dangerous to ever be released. What changed? Brazil still struggles with violence against children, though the epidemic of death squad killings has diminished since the 1990s. Poverty persists. Favelas remain dangerous. Vulnerable children still exist. But Marcelo's case, along with international pressure and human rights advocacy, contributed to increased awareness of child protection issues in Brazil. It didn't solve the problem, but it made the invisible children a little more visible. More than 3 decades have passed since Marcelo Costa de Andrade murdered 14 boys in the favelas of Rio de Janeiro. The media coverage has faded. The sensational headlines about the vampire of Niteroi are now historical footnotes. The case has been cataloged, analyzed, and filed away. But for the families of those 14 children, time doesn't heal. Mothers still grieve for sons who never came home. Siblings still remember brothers who disappeared one day and were found dead days or weeks later. The families live with questions that can never be answered. What were their sons' final moments like? Did they suffer? Did they understand what was happening? Could anything have been done differently? And somewhere in a psychiatric hospital, Marcelo Costa de Andrade sits, still convinced he sent those children to heaven, still unable to comprehend the magnitude of what he destroyed, still believing he was following God's will. But for the families of Oder, Anderson, Ivan, and the 11 other boys whose names we may never know, there was no heaven, no salvation, no mercy, only the unbearable grief of losing a child to senseless violence. 14 boys, 9 months, one monster who believed he was an angel. This was the vampire of Niteroi. And this is why we must never forget his victims.